Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever it is that you may be across the world. We're so glad that you can join us for this week's episode of Stories and Myths. And I am thrilled to introduce to you tonight my co-host, my compadre, my partner in crime, John Farrell. And John works with me at Inspiration Ministries in the Charlotte, North Carolina area. We both work on inspiration.org. And so, John, it is great to have you here tonight. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, doing well. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me to join you tonight. And I hope that it is a success in your eyes and in everyone else that is watching it.
Well, I'm sure that it will be. And once people get to know you, they're going to love you. John is an excellent writer, an excellent editor, and he is also has done his master's work in early American literature. So he is well versed in the things that we're going to be talking about here on Stories and Myths. And remember, Stories and Myths, we're talking about stories from history that will inspire, that will inform, that will challenge, and might even infuriate you. But we will also be working to debunk some of the myths from history as well. We want to say hello to Kelly Williams Duncan, who is joining us tonight. We're so glad you're with us, Kelly, and looking forward to the program. I did want to make a very special announcement. Between last week's program and today, I received my own first copy. I'll put it right there so everybody can see it, of Victor. As you can see, it's the actual copy, the actual paper and so forth. And Grant's famous quote from his presidential run, his slogan was, "Let us have peace," which is chiseled onto his tomb in New York City, Grant's tomb. That's a question for you, John. Who is buried in Grant's tomb? You know where that question comes from?
I'm assuming it comes from something related to Grant.
Well, yes, but not really. It was Groucho Marx had a TV show in the 1950s. I think it was called You Bet Your Life. And he asked a bunch of questions. And if they couldn't get any of the questions right, he asked that as the final question, who's buried in Grant's tomb? So what do you think is the answer to the question?
Isn't it unknown? Isn't it a mystery? And like it's never been solved? It has been solved?
It was solved in the 1890s. Yeah.
Oh, okay. But it's always one of those, it's not him. It's not who you would think. It's something else. And I unfortunately do not know the answer to that.
All right. So here's the answer. For those who want to know, those who have been dying to know who's buried in Grant's tomb, the answer is no one is buried in Grant's tomb.
That's what I said originally.
Ulysses S. Grant and Julia Grant are in two red granite sarcophagi, entombed. So when you go in, the granite is brushed and polished and just very beautiful. And so they're not actually buried. They are actually entombed in Grant's tomb. So that's the total correct answer. So John, tell us a little bit about your background, a little bit of your information and bio.
Absolutely. So I'm a proud alum of App State in Boone, North Carolina, and I went directly into the publishing world and publishing industry. I've been in some form or fashion of the publishing industry, writing, doing publishing, or editing for the better part of 2 decades, and with a little bit of marketing. Sorry,
somebody's calling. It's our first question for the night.
No, I'm sure it was a spammer asking if my car insurance was up to date.
Asking if my warranty was turned off for the Stories and Myths program.
Right, which as soon as I answer your question, I will turn it off. My bad. But yeah, to continue, and with a little bit of marketing thrown in. And so I've been at Inspiration Ministries, as Craig said. I've been there since August of 2019, so about a year and a half, and love what I do. And get a write every day and get a edit and study different things. So I love what I do and glad to be here.
Well, excellent. Well, we're glad to have you. And John is a joy to work with, and he's very talented. And so I encourage you to check out John's work as he's turning off his ringer, and we see his ear. Check out John's work. Very, very attractive ear and nice haircut on inspiration.org. Just go to inspiration.org and enter his name in the search, and you can check out all of his different articles. But John, you have some questions for me regarding the new book, Victor, The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant, and in particular about one of your heroes. So tell me what it is that we're going to be talking about tonight.
Absolutely. So we're going to be talking, I know last week you delved a little bit into Grant's relationship with Mark Twain, but I want to dive a little further into that because Mark Twain is someone who I've studied a lot in grad school and in undergrad, and someone that even before I was in college read a lot of his stuff, and even beyond the Huckleberry Finn and the Tom Sawyer stuff, but more of his satires and his essays and articles and stuff like that. So I've always appreciated his writing style. I would like to say sometimes I do write like him. That probably falls flat a lot of times. But
you're a very good writer.
Well, thank you. I think you're lifting my halo a little high. So I do want to talk about that relationship between Twain and Grant a little more. And one of the things, and I haven't had an opportunity to read your book, as you know, because I just received it yesterday. But I will be reading it, and but I've listened to a lot of stories that you've told me over the years. And one of the things that I want to ask you to dive into a little more that I'm very, very interested about is his relationship, or Grant had a sculptor that came into his life late in his life, like when he was near death.
That's right.
And Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, was very integral in connecting the sculptor, whose name is Carl Gerhardt, with Ulysses S. Grant and the rest of the Grant family. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that relationship and what kind of blossomed out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a chapter in Victor, and I talk about the relationship began between Mark Twain and Carl Gerhardt, who was one of his neighbors in Hartford, Connecticut. And one day, just out of the clear blue, Gerhardt shows up on Twain's doorstep and says, "Hello, Mr. Twain. I'm Carl Gerhardt. I'm a neighbor, and I'm also a sculptor. And I wonder if you'd be interested in coming to my house and seeing some of my sculptures." Well, I mean, how many times do you have somebody at your front door say that to you? And
all the time.
Yeah, all the time. So Twain was, of course, intrigued by this. And so he walked with Gerhardt over to his house, and he walked in, and Gerhardt showed him a sculpture of his wife, which was kind of a little risque, but a very well done sculpture. And so Twain was very interested in this. And so he went and he found two world-class sculptors, and he told them, "Listen, I've got someone who I think is talented, but I don't have the trained eye to find out how talented. Would you go with me to this man's house and tell me what you think?" Well, both of these sculptors went to the house, and they were very impressed. And they saw that the sculptor still needed a little bit of training, but that he was very, very talented. And so Twain, out of the goodness of his heart, went ahead and became the benefactor for Carl Gerhardt. So Twain and his wife paid Gerhardt's tuition, and Gerhardt and his wife went to Paris, and he studied sculpture in Paris. So years later, he came back, and if you ever see the original copy of Huckleberry Finn, one of Gerhardt's sculptures of Mark Twain is in that original book, a photograph of it.
Very cool.
So one day, Gerhardt shows up at the doorstep of Twain again, and he said, and he's carrying this big piece of wood, and there's something under a towel, and so he takes the towel off of it, and here it is, a clay sculpture of Ulysses S. Grant. And Mark Twain says in his autobiography that it was the closest that he had ever seen any piece of art ever come to capturing the real look of what Grant looked like. But there were some things wrong in the forehead and in the nose. And so, Twain pointed that out to Gerhardt, and Gerhardt said, well, I've been doing this from photographs. It would be very helpful if I could actually go and sit with the general to do this. And Mark Twain said, well, it's so good that I think that the Grant family would be okay with you doing that. So the next morning, the two of them got on a train in Hartford and went to New York City. Grant lived on a street just off of where Grand Central, or not Grand Central, but Central Park was located, 63rd Street. And so they showed up unannounced on the steps of the Grant family now, carrying this sculpture. And so General Grant was in his bedroom. They kept a fire going. This was the spring of 1885, and he was dying of cancer, and every day throat cancer, very painful throat cancer. And every day that he was strong enough, he would work on the memoirs with a yellow legal pad. And so he was tucked away in his bedroom, but then there was an anteroom where his family was gathered. Several members of the family were gathered. And so Mark Twain walked up the steps because for those who don't know, Mark Twain was actually the publisher for Grant's memoirs. And so he had become very close with the family. So Mark Twain walked up the steps to the second floor, and he went into the anteroom, and he was greeted very, joyfully by the family. And he said, I have a sculptor downstairs who's done a sculpture of General Grant, and we wanted to show it to you. Well, Grant's youngest son, his name was Jesse Grant, and his wife was very excited about this. And she was there in the room, and she said, this is amazing. She said, just the other day, I had a dream that you brought a sculptor over to do a sculpture of the general. I mean, that's amazing, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's cool.
And so, of course, Twain was feeling pretty good about this. And so she said, well, couldn't he come up here and allow us to look at the sculpture? So Twain was very happy, and he went down to get Gerhardt and brought him up. And he was really, really thrilled. And the family, they just totally loved this. Sorry, a little bit of
is that your cell phone going off?
Sorry, go ahead. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Was that your cell phone going off?
What's that?
Was that your cell phone going off?
No, I was checking a comment, and unfortunately it brought up our own video here. So you live and you learn. So Gary, hello. Please share your comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear any comment or question that you might have. Good to see you. My friend Gary is with us tonight as well. So at any rate, Gerhardt brings the sculpture upstairs, and the family's just wowed by it. But they saw immediately the problem with the forehead and the problem with the nose. And so they went and got several other photographs, and they brought them in, and Julia Grant, Ulysses' wife, pulled up this little footstool, and she was kneeling on the footstool and looking like right here at the sculpture to see what needed to be done with it. And finally, Grant, who was very weak, he had lost a lot of weight, he was in a ton of pain, but he came out with his cane from his room because he heard what was going on, and he wanted to see the sculpture too. Well, Julia Grant was like, get back in your room. You're going to catch your death of cold. And so he turned around kind of sadly hobbled back into his room. But as he got into the room, he turned around and he said, well, couldn't the sculptor come into my room and do the sculpture of me in my room? Well, of course, both Gerhardt and Twain were ecstatic. Oh, yeah, they were ecstatic. So they carried the sculpture in there. Grant, because of the cancer in his throat, he couldn't lie down on his back or on his side to sleep. So what they did is they had 2 leather chairs, and these 2 chairs are actually at the Grant Cottage on Mount McGregor. That cottage is where Grant passed away in July of 1885, and everything is exactly as it was the day that Grant died. Wow. So his 2 leather chairs are there in this adjoining room to the room where he died, and they put them together so that he could kind of put his feet out, cover himself with a blanket, but still be sitting up. And he slept like that for nearly a year because when he laid back, he would feel like he was choking, and he was terribly afraid of choking to death. And so he got into these leather chairs, and Gerhardt pulled up another chair and a table, and he started working on the clay sculpture while Grant just sat there very quietly. Well, Grant really had a hard time sleeping because of the pain. And they gave him morphine every night, but eventually it would wear off and the pain would wake him up. And then he had a hard time falling back to sleep. And so this was something that was so out of the ordinary and very peaceful. And so Grant literally was just about to fall asleep when one of his editors, Adam Badeau, came bursting into the room. General Grant, I have this question, and I really like what you did this morning on the manuscript, but I want you to answer this. And then he saw the sculpture and he went, wow, that is really good. But General Grant, please answer these questions. So Grant wakes up and answers the questions, and Badeau once again says, great job. Nice to meet you. And then he leaves. So it's quiet again, and Gerhardt's working on the sculpture, and Grant's eyes start to fade, and all of a sudden the door opens again, and it's Grant's assistant. His name was Harrison Tyrrell. He was a former slave, an African-American, and he was there to give Grant his milk because that was pretty much the only nutrition that Grant was able to have. He couldn't eat solid food, so he was losing weight like crazy. And even the milk, though, was like, he said it was like drinking molten lead. It was so painful for him, but it was what was keeping him alive.
Because I think you had mentioned this before too, that it hurt for him to swallow anything. And so I guess anything, I would imagine anything acidic would have played havoc on not only the back of his tongue, but his throat. So yeah, and even if milk's a very soothing drink to have, and yet it still caused a lot of pain. Wow.
Yeah. And the amazing thing, and I mentioned this in the book, and I think I mentioned it last week, Grant didn't take any opiates. He didn't take any morphine or painkillers during the day because he had lost all of his money in this giant Ponzi scheme that he didn't know anything about. He had joined a Wall Street investment firm that had been started by his son and a shyster named Ferdinand Ward. And the whole time Ward was robbing from the firm and robbing Peter to pay Paul, but also to pay himself. And the whole thing collapsed after a couple of years, and they lost everything. And not long after that, Grant was diagnosed with incurable throat cancer. So he needed to do something to make sure his wife was taken care of financially after his death. And that's why he agreed with Mark Twain to write his memoirs. So every day that he could, he would work on the memoirs, but he wouldn't take any painkillers because he wanted to keep his mind sharp. And so he was in terrible pain. And so when Tyrrell gave him this milk, it was there to keep him alive, but it was terribly painful. So of course that woke him up again. So then Tyrrell looked at the sculpture and went, "Oh, that's the general. That's the general." He was very impressed. And so Tyrrell left. And so Gearhart goes back to work, and Grant's sitting there, and all of a sudden, one eye starts to droop, and then the other eye starts to droop, and pretty soon, peacefully, Grant fell asleep. And he was out for a couple of hours. And so Gerhardt was able to complete that sculpture. And now you have to buy it through eBay or through some sort of a collector's website or company, but you can get either a terracotta version of that sculpture or a brass version. It's a little bit pricey, but
I imagine.
Yeah, but they are beautiful. And my daughter and I went to Mark Twain's home and took the tour of the home there in Hartford, Connecticut. And I don't know if it was the original. It might have been, but one of the terracotta versions of the sculpture was on the mantle of Mark Twain's writing room in his home in Hartford. And I asked the tour guide about it. I said, "Is that the Gerhardt statue?" And she said, "Yes, it is."
And she's like, "Don't get any ideas, mister.
Yeah, stay away from it. Don't knock it off and break it."
There's a reason it's behind glass. Or I don't know if it was
well, it wasn't behind glass, but I think it was like a velvet rope, and we couldn't go on the other side of it.
Yeah. So while we're on the subject of Gerhardt, I want to ask, did he also create Grant's death mask as well?
Yeah, the family was so impressed with the sculpture. And this was a tradition in the 19th century to do a death mask using plaster of Paris or some similar type of material. In fact, when I went to the Smithsonian, they have Abraham Lincoln's death mask and his hands in plaster. And so you could see exactly, I mean, it's amazing to look at it and say, I'm looking at the face of exactly what Abraham looked like at the time of his death.
So what is the purpose of the death mask? Just for, I have no idea, but I imagine there's other people that don't know exactly the purpose or the reason behind someone like Grant would have a death mask made.
Well, in the 19th century, obviously, it's not something that is done very much anymore. But
getting one.
Yeah, but I mean, it's still done. There are people who do it. But in the 19th century, they wanted to have a memorial, and it looks like a statue. It's a perfect rendering of the face, and it's not something that you can comfortably do while you're alive because you can't breathe. And
so they actually put it on the guy's face?
Yeah. Yeah,
Oh,
it's
wow.
plaster of Paris. So they probably
put
Vaseline or something on the face, or oil or something, and then they put the plaster on and they let it dry, and then they pull it off, and there you have the final face of Ulysses S. Grant, which the photo of that death mask is in the companion book that's coming out May 25th called Forward, the Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant. And
looking forward to reading
there are photographs in both this book, which is Victor, and then there are also other photographs in Forward. So that's something. Another thing that's in Victor that I think people would really like is that we have maps. We've included maps of every battle that we discuss, so that you're able to, as you're reading about the battle, you could go back to the map and see what it is that we're talking about. Then we also put the photographs in of many of the leading characters in the book, so that you can put a face to the name.
Very cool. Well, so getting back to the relationship between Twain and Grant, as we all know, Twain was a very prolific writer, and Grant was not a writer. So I'm just curious, how much of, if at all, did Twain influence or assist in writing Grant's biography? Did he help at all, or did he just provide publishing experience?
Well, I love this question because it has been a controversy since the time of Grant's death. You said Grant was not a writer. That is only partially true.
Okay, well, he's not known as a writer like Twain is known as a writer.
Correct.
He's known as a great general and great president. He's not known for first and foremost as a writer, whereas that is what Twain is mainly known for.
Right.
What I meant.
However, Grant wrote all of his orders, and when he was president, he wrote all of his speeches, which is something that doesn't happen anymore.
Oh, absolutely.
Most speeches are not written by the president; they're edited by him, and he or she puts in the changes at the end. But Grant also wrote all of his presidential proclamations. So he had been writing for 20 plus years when he was approached to write articles for a group called the Century Magazine. And at first, the first stab that he took at writing the Battle of Shiloh was not much different than his report to the War Department. And everyone was at Century Magazine was pretty disappointed by this because they had already read it. And they said, this isn't much different. We're not seeing anything really that we haven't already seen here. And it's a little dry. And so they sent a man named Robert Underwood Johnson, who was the editor of the Century Magazine, out to Long Branch, New Jersey, where the Grants had their summer cottage. And he sat down with Grant and he basically, kind of mentored him on what it was that people were looking for in these magazines. And Grant, one of the things about Ulysses S. Grant is that he was a quick learner. And once he learned something, he remembered it. And so he quickly understood what it was that they were looking for. And he adopted that into his writing. And so that rewritten article on Shiloh was absolutely fantastic because he put into it what he was thinking during the battle, what he was feeling, what was going on around him. He described the scenes just like any good writer would do. And so Grant developed into a very good writer. And yet many people thought this book, the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, is so well written that it had to be Twain. It had to be Twain that wrote it. Mark Twain denied it 100%. He said, no, it was completely written by Ulysses S. Grant, but it was an ongoing controversy up until about 4 years ago. And it was finally put to rest by a man named, what's that?
I said that recently. Wow.
Yeah. It was finally put to rest by a man named Ron Chernow. And for those of you who don't know, Ron Chernow wrote the book Hamilton about Alexander Hamilton that became the Broadway musical. And the next book that he wrote was a book about Ulysses S. Grant. And so there were certain things that Chernow wanted to investigate and find the answers for, one of which was Grant's problem with drinking, which he confirmed that from a modern standpoint, he spoke to his brother, who was a medical doctor. And from a modern standpoint, Grant could be considered a textbook alcoholic. Oh, wow. But he overcame that and finally abstained from alcohol before he became president and then through the rest of his life. So that was one of the questions. The other one of several questions that Chernow investigated was, did Grant actually write the memoirs? And so Chernow, because he had these big, great best-selling, New York Times best-selling books, and then he had Hamilton on Broadway, which, everyone in the world, well, not everybody, but a lot of people in the world know about, he was able to call the people at the Library of Congress and say, I want to answer this question. May I have access to the original manuscript, the handwritten manuscript of the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant? And they took him into this, temperature-controlled room, fireproof room. They opened up the drawer. He looked at the manuscript, and it was almost all in the hand of Ulysses S. Grant. There was a little bit in the hand of a man named William Dawson, who became Grant's stenographer when Grant got so weak that he couldn't write himself. And there were small little notes that were clearly in the margins from a guy named Mark Twain.
And so he added some editorial influence, but he didn't write it. So
it was very minor, Most of it was punctuation issues and some grammar issues, but he didn't change the bulk of it at all. So yes,
So
written entirely by Ulysses S. Grant with the editorial help of his eldest son, Fred Grant, who was an absolute rock for his father. He did a lot of the research and a lot of the editing. And then also by Adam Badeau, who had been on Grant's Army staff and had risen to the rank of brigadier general. And then he was involved in the diplomatic corps during Grant's presidency. Grant invited him to work with Fred on the editing as Grant was and the research as Grant was doing the writing. And sadly, at the towards the end of Grant's life, Badeau said, "I'm doing too much work. You need to pay me more money, and if you don't, I quit." And so Grant said, "Bye-bye." And it was the end of that relationship. And it was an awful thing for Badeau to do to a dying man who had been basically his paramour. He had Badeau had risen up from a nobody to general and then a diplomat on the coat sleeves of coattails of Ulysses S. Grant. And so it's one of the tragedies that happened towards the end of his life.
Awesome. So their relation, or Twain and Grant's relationship from a writer relationship was very different than someone I'm very familiar with that I studied a lot in grad school, Maxwell, Perkins, and Thomas Wolfe, where Thomas Wolfe, one of his most famous works, Oh, Look Homeward Angel, and there's famous stories about him going to the offices of Scribner and Sons in New York City with crates and crates of loose paper and dropping them on Maxwell Perkins' office floor and saying, "Here, make something of it." And I want to say it was like somewhere in the upwards of like 17 crates of paper. I have to look at my research and see exactly if that's right. But and so a lot of people have debated, oh, well, is Look Homeward Angel really Maxwell Perkins, or is that Thomas Wolfe's work?
Right.
And actually, what was interesting is that Look Homeward Angel obviously came out, but several decades ago, a book called Oh, Lost came out, which is supposedly the original Look Homeward Angel without all the editorial influences.
Like interesting.
And I have both of those, and it's interesting reading them side by side, and it's very entertaining, but obviously is not for this conversation. But you mentioned his son, Grant's son Fred, and again, not for this conversation, but in the future, I would like to delve into his relationship with Grant, and
it's amazing
his influence.
Yeah,
and I know
Fred,
you have a deep respect for him. So
I have an incredible respect for Frederick Grant. He was there for his father in any way that he could be. And Fred was 14 years old when he traveled. His dad gave him this little pony, and they traveled together during the Battle of Vicksburg. It's hard to imagine today a general taking his 14-year-old son with him, but they were side by side, Grant on his horse and Fred on this little pony, And Fred actually got shot in the leg. They didn't tell Julia Grant this, but Fred got shot by a Confederate bullet. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, Fred was a very young casualty in the Civil War. He obviously survived. And then Fred went on to go to West Point and worked his way up the ranks. He was a colonel when his father became ill. And then after his father's death, he was promoted to a general. He fought in the Spanish-American War, and he was an advisor in World War I. And there is a photograph of Fred Dent not Dent, that's his uncle, he was named after, Fred Grant, General Frederick Grant, on a horse in front of a biplane during World War I. And there's a photo of that in the forward book. It's wonderful.
Very nice.
Found it on the Library of Congress website.
Very cool. Well, so getting back to Mark Twain and Ulysses S. Grant, um, kind of going back in time, uh, I know your book focuses on the last 2 years of Ulysses Grant's life, but if we could go back a little before that, how were these two big personalities, Grant and Twain, first introduced? And I know they might have run into each other on a battlefield, and we'll save that for my next question. But beyond that, when they actually first met, and weren't possibly shooting at each other, what was that? What was that like, and where were they at? And if you could go into that, I'd be curious to hear.
Grant was the 18th president of the United States, and he was in his office. I don't think the Oval Office had been built yet. And so he was in his office in the White House, and a mutual friend. By this point, Twain was becoming known. I think Tom Sawyer had become popular by this point, and a mutual friend brought Twain to the White House and introduced him to Ulysses S. Grant. Well, Twain was, in awe of being in not only in the White House, but in the presence of someone who he held to be one of the greatest Americans. Twain really respected Ulysses S. Grant. And so he just stood there like in awe. Well, Grant actually hardly spoke to anyone unless he got to know you. Once he got to know you, he was a raconteur. He spoke, he told wonderful stories and jokes, but not until he got to know you. And so if you didn't know Grant, he wouldn't say a word. So these two titans of the 19th century stood there in the Oval Office, or in the office of the president at the time, just staring at each other for a long time in silence. And so finally Twain said, "Well, Mr. President, I'm not embarrassed. Are you?" And that kind of broke the ice, and they chit-chatted a little bit. And then Twain was escorted out of the office. And so probably 6 years later, might have even been 7 years later, after Grant had left the White House, he went for a 2-year world tour with his wife, and they went all around the world. And that's a whole other, we could have a whole other evening discussion about that. When he returned back from this world tour, a lot of people wanted him to run for a third term as president. And his political handlers basically said to him, "If you run, you're going to win." So he didn't have a job, and he was out of money. He spent all his money on his world tour. And so it was like, this might be a good idea to run for the presidency again. And so he was taken to Chicago for a major political rally. And it was mostly veterans that were there at this rally, and different people got up to speak and encourage him to run. And Twain was kind of like the cherry on top. He was going to be the final speaker, and everybody was looking forward to him speaking by this time because everybody knew who he was. And so he got up onto the platform waiting to be introduced. He walked over next to General Grant, President Grant by this point, and he leaned over and he said, he leaned over to say hello. And Grant said, "Hello, Mr. Twain. I'm not embarrassed. Are you?" So Twain, Grant remembered, and that was Grant. His mind was like a steel trap. So I want to say hi, though, to some folks who are joining us. Marlene Banks, she writes, "Twain and Grant meeting in the White House. What a picture that conjures up."
Absolutely.
And I totally agree. It would have been wonderful to have seen these two in that moment. Our good friend Bernard Baker stopped in and said interesting. So hello to St. Bernard. And so we're glad that everyone could join us today. If you're here with us, feel free to say hello. And if you have a question, go ahead and write it in the comments section. And if we have time, we'll get to it tonight. If not, we'll try to get to it next week. So what's next?
Well, so I have a question about, because the outward personality that Twain exudes is very outgoing, very exuberant. Whereas, and this might be me just not knowing that much about Grant, he seems very stoic and very the opposite of what Twain is, at least in the public eye. Yet it's safe to say that they were good friends towards the end of his life. How what how did that friendship, that was their first meeting, but how did that friendship blossom into where not only a friendship, but it was a working relationship as well too, as he was writing his memoirs.
Yeah. What happened is that one of the great embarrassments in American history, and really a shame on our country and on the Congress of the United States, was that when Grant ran for president, he had to give up his military pension. And when he left the White House after 2 terms, they did not give him a presidential pension, and they didn't restore his military pension. So Grant,
wow.
the savior of the Union, 2-term president, and I don't say savior of the Union lightly, it was his strategy that won the war, along with the work of everyone, but it was his strategy that allowed the work of everyone else to be, to do what needed to be done. And so, and of course, working with Abraham Lincoln as well. But, Lincoln had 6 generals before Grant, and they all lost to Robert E. Lee. So Grant was the difference and was the reason for the winning of the war. So savior of the Union, 2-term president, and he was penniless. That's disgusting. In the United Kingdom, in Great Britain, when the general who had won over Waterloo, or during Waterloo, after that victory over Napoleon, the Parliament of Great Britain had lavished this general with millions of pounds and more than one house, an opulent, beautiful house. And yet the United States gave nothing to Ulysses S. Grant. And so when Twain found out about that, which he found out from Fred, they were campaigning for Garfield for president. And one of the things about Grant was, after he lost to Garfield in the nomination for the Republican nomination, he still wanted the Republicans to win. He felt that at that point in American history, that in order to keep the gains that happened during the Civil War, that the Republicans needed to be in office. And so Grant went out and campaigned for Garfield, which is funny because Grant never campaigned for himself, ever. But he did go out and campaign for Garfield. And so he was in Hartford, Connecticut, and he was with Mark Twain as they were, polling for James Garfield. And after the speech, or before the speech, they were on the train, and Twain was joking that, that Grant had millions of dollars. And Fred said, "Hey, Mr. Twain, let's go back here. I want to talk to you." And so they went out of earshot, and Fred said, "No, my dad doesn't really have that much money." And Twain was disgusted by this. And so word started to get out, probably through Mark Twain and others, of this travesty. And so several of the robber barons of the age, J.P. Morgan and Vanderbilt and Carnegie, they all started talking to each other about how awful this was. And they raised from their own money a trust fund so that Grant would have a monthly stipend. And then they gave him $200,000, which was a lot of money in that time, to go out and buy a house. And so Ulysses and Julia bought a brownstone on East 66th Street, just off of Central Park. And that was where Grant and Twain really started to get to know each other, because Twain had his publishing offices in Union Square, which was only a few blocks from there. And so Twain would come over at lunch, and they would, before the cancer, they would smoke cigars and tell stories, and really got to know each other. And then, of course, Twain finally convinced Grant to write his memoirs, and Grant gave him the contract. And so Twain was very involved in that last year of Grant's life and was there quite often and became very close to Ulysses, but also to the Grant family.
Very cool. So one of the things that I previously mentioned is prior to them first meeting in the White House, they might have had a chance encounter on a battlefield in Missouri. And I know that Mark Twain wrote a short story about this. I was wondering if, not talking about the short story, but if you could just tell us a little bit about this chance encounter that they might have had. Who knows?
Well, they did not necessarily see each other, but they were very close to fighting in Missouri at the very beginning of the war. And when Grant was ill, Twain put two and two together and realized that they almost shot at each other during the war, because Samuel Clemens was in the Confederate Army, and Colonel Ulysses S. Grant was leading a regiment that was going to find the guerrillas that that Samuel Clemens was fighting with. And so when Twain found out about this, he told this story and he embellished it for General Grant, who laughed and laughed and laughed. He thought it was wonderful. And so Twain wrote it into an article, which you can actually read. It's out online, and it's called The Private History of a Campaign That Failed. The Private History of a Campaign That Failed. And so there was a high likelihood that they might have shot at each other. But what had happened is, and Grant shares this in his personal memoirs, this was the first time he ever led troops into battle. Before, he was always an officer under a higher ranking officer, especially in the Mexican War. And so he went into this battle with great fear and trepidation. And so as they are cresting this hill, they knew that these guerrillas were down in this valley, just on the other side of the hill. And Grant shared in his memoirs that as they're going up this hill, his heart was going higher and higher in his throat, and he was full of all this fear. But when they got to the crest of the hill and looked over, they saw the remnants of a camp that was there, but the Confederates had skedaddled, and they had heard that Grant was on his way, and so they left. And Grant said, "My heart returned to its normal pace, and I learned a lesson that I never forgot in the rest of the war, and that was the enemy was just as afraid of me as I was of them." And that helped Grant to have a calmness and a coolness about him in the rest of the war. I share that in the Victor book, several different scenes where, shells are falling around him, and he's just sitting there writing his notes. In the Battle of the Wilderness, these shells start falling around his location, and another officer came up to him and said, "General, wouldn't it be prudent for us to move back to another location?" And in pure, beautiful Grant style, his answer was, "I think it would be wiser to pull up some guns and defend our present location." And that was the difference. What I just said was the difference between every other general and Ulysses S. Grant. Wow. And it's a beautiful thing. Gary Sanowski writes in and he says, was there a reason why Grant's military retirement wasn't restored to him after his presidency? Well, let's just tag on to what I just said. You're right, Gary, but not completely right, because they did finally restore his pension in the spring of 1885, but only after the Congress came to know that he was dying of cancer. So it was a sympathy vote to, not only help Grant, but also to make sure that Julia Grant had the, portion of that. She wouldn't get the full pension, but she would get a portion of that during the retirement. And of course, at that point, they didn't know whether the memoirs would sell very well or not. So this was a great relief to them. So, but the answer to your question, Gary, is that Grant had to get rid of his pen or step down from being the lieutenant general and the head of the United States Army in order to run for president. And when he did that, he had to forfeit his military retirement. Then, after he left the White House, as I said earlier, there was no pension for a former president. Not until Harry S. Truman in the 1950s did they have a pension for a president, which is hard to imagine. And so Grant had nothing. And so the problem was, in terms of restoring his military pension, that he had received all this money from these wealthy friends. And so many people in Congress, and most of them were the Democrats and his political opponents, said, he's being taken care of from his friends. We don't need to help him. He's a fat cat now in New York City. He doesn't need our help. And so they actually voted down the bill to restore his pension, which is hard to imagine. Again, it was a shame and one of our dark moments in American history. But then when word slipped out, eventually word came out that he was dying of throat cancer, and they recalled the bill, which was passed by the Senate. But it was an amazing moment of political theater. And again, I share this moment in the book, Victor, The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant, where when they passed the bill, it was the very last day of the term of President Arthur. And the inauguration was supposed to happen at noon for President Grover Cleveland. Well, they were rushing to get the bill through, and they ran out of time. And the Constitution says that all activity has to end at noon, and then the presidential inauguration takes place. So what happened is the House passed the bill just before noon. They raced over to the Senate and gathered all the senators into the Senate chamber. It went past noon, and they sent one of the staffers to get a ladder. This is all true. He climbed a ladder and he turned the clock back before noon, and they had the vote. This is all true. They had
like something we would do.
Passed it, and they ran it across the hall to still President Arthur, who signed it, and it restored Grant to be to his retirement. It's an amazing story. So thank you for that question, Gary.
Wow. So I don't know how much time we have left.
But we'll end with this final question.
Okay, so this one is not. Mark Twain is known for his social commentary and for his political astuteness and his comments about what's going on. I was just wondering if you knew if he had any comments or any thoughts about Grant's time as president or his time in the war. Like, I don't know if you've read anything about what his own thoughts were about Grant prior to meeting him.
Twain was one of Grant's greatest fans. He respected him greatly. And I think that we in the early 21st century would be wise to recognize that position that Mark Twain took concerning Ulysses S. Grant in the 19th century. We respect Mark Twain, but the Lost Cause School, which was pro-Confederate, they were so embarrassed by what the planter class did to lead the South into that tragic Civil War. They were so embarrassed that they fought a war and that they brought the South to its knees over this issue of slavery, that they had to kind of rewrite history. And it was called the Lost Cause School. And these historians and these writers had to say that the war was not about slavery, even though throughout the entire war, all of the Confederate leaders said it was about general that'll be another discussion for another time.
Absolutely.
But Longstreet, General Longstreet, when he was asked about it, he said, it's funny, during the entire war, that was the only thing that we said the war was about, was slavery. and yet now we're saying it's not. So in order to whitewash things, they had to make General Robert E. Lee into what is now called the Marble Man, to really raise up his stature. Even though he was the general that led the Army of Northern Virginia to defeat. Right. And eventually, at the end of the war, he was the general over the entire Confederate Army. But they couldn't say that he lost the war. They had to say that Grant was a butcher, that Grant just beat him down by a war of attrition, and that was it. Grant didn't have any strategy. And you read some of these things, and I read this during my research for this book, and some of these writers are so disrespectful of Grant. When you know what happened, when you read the actual events, it makes you want to throw up that it's this propaganda against Grant. So when I was growing up, I don't know how it was for you, John, but when I was growing up, I was taught, because I was a history minor in college, and I actually took 6 years of 6 years of history in high school, because I went to a private school for the first 2 years, and I completed 4 years.
The reason I majored in English.
And then I switched to a public school, and I did 2 more years. So I did 6 years of high school history, and then I was a minor in history in college. I almost majored in it, but I didn't know how I would make a living as a historian. And so I was taught that Grant was the second worst president next to Buchanan. I don't know what you were taught, but
I thought Nixon was the worst president.
Well, Nixon, of course, is way up there. But when I was a kid, Nixon was higher than Grant. And that is absolute poppycock. I'll try to use a word that is kind. That's
from the 1880s.
What's that?
That's from the 1880s.
Yeah, that'd be a good 19th century word. Grant was actually a very important and a very great president. They point to all of the scandals that happened during his presidency. And yes, there were scandals, but Grant was never involved in any of them. And when he finally realized the truth of what was going on, he caused those people to be pushed out of his White House. And so, again, they had to rewrite history to make him out to be this, terrible president, not really that great of a general. But then when you listen to Twain, he talks about Grant as one of the greatest Americans who ever lived. And it wasn't just Twain, John. Teddy Roosevelt, you've heard of him? Mount Rushmore, that guy? He said,
Teddy Bear.
Yeah. When he was vice president, he was asked about Ulysses S. Grant, and he said, there are 3 great Americans. The 3 greatest Americans are George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Ulysses S. Grant. He said the second tier, there's people like Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton.
And the Rough Rider himself.
What's that?
And the Rough Rider himself, Teddy Roosevelt.
Right. The Rough Rider himself said of Grant, he was one of the 3 greatest Americans in history.
That's awesome.
So Twain agreed with that. And when Grant died, Twain spoke very highly of Grant to many people. And he said that he was a truly good man, or a truly great man, and superlatively good.
That's awesome. So, and you talk a little bit about revisionist history, and that's something for another time, not just with as it pertains to Grant, but that's something for a later episode that I would love to dive into.
Absolutely.
Just revisionist history throughout history. Because
and
there's
the
a lot
lost
of
cause specifically, because in the last 30 years, there has been a reexamination of Grant and his proper place in American history. And so that is why one of the reasons I wrote this book was to help restore Grant to his proper place in history as one of the blocks in that wall. Absolutely. And so that's been a motivation for writing this book.
Awesome. Well, I've enjoyed learning more about the book from your perspective, and I'm sure in the future we'll learn more, and not only about Grant but other things as we go further along.
Sounds good. And for those who are interested in getting your own copy of Victor, the final battle of Ulysses S. Grant, go to grantvictorbook.com, grantvictorbook.com, and you can order your copy. Also, you could go to the Grant Victor Book Facebook page. There's many other interviews and videos and a lot of interesting stuff there. And so I encourage you to do that. I invite you to buy the book. And for those of you who have purchased the book, and if you've read it, I would ask you to go to Amazon.com and do a review, if you would, of the book. People are starting to post reviews on Amazon. And just so you know, the more reviews you get, the more that Amazon puts light on that book. And so you help out the book, you help out me, and you help out my co-host, John Farrell, by adding your review there on
Yes.
the book.
So
Or on
benefit greatly.
So once again, John, any final words as we wrap?
No, I do want to piggyback what you said, and in the near future, we will be there will be a book excerpt from his book on inspiration.org, as well as an interview,
and an article.
As well as an article. And so I invite you to check that out as well, and we'll definitely keep you in the loop on when those are published and posted. And thank you all for joining us.
Well, thank you, John. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and Kelly Williams Duncan just said, I'm interested in how revisionist history is destroying our country. I think that's a wonderful topic. That
let's write it down as one of our themes in the coming weeks.
That might be more of a more than a one episode conversation.
Yeah, maybe a two-parter.
Yeah, but it would be an interesting one, because I'm curious to see what our viewers have to say about that, and questions they have, and kind of to bend your ear and get your perspective on that, Craig.
Very good. Well, thank you, John, and thank you all for joining us. And we will see you here again next week, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as we like to say, same bat time, same bat channel for stories and myths. Good night.